It down and educates, informs, and explains useful caregiver strategies and techniques that 25 years of non-clinical family caregiving have taught him. You can listen or call in and be part of the show. 888-565-1470 to ask your questions. And now, here's David Levy.
Good evening, Boca Raton, Florida, and the world. This is the Caregiver Reality Show. I'm your host, David Levy, gerontologist, here tonight with my co-host, Paul Vattiato.
Hi, David.
Hi, Paul. And we're going to jump right into a bunch of things because last week we were talking about the fact that Paul and I are both caregivers for our wives, as well as the fact that we both try and hold down full-time jobs. And so when we talk to you and we tell you we understand what it is that caregivers are going through, we understand because, like Pogo said, we are they. And anytime that you want to challenge that issue, we can get down and dirty and into the nitty-gritty. I will jump in and say it's been a very long weekend. Not only was I dealing with issues that my wife has, and we're going to touch on that in just a moment, as you are as well, Paul, but my uncle in Pennsylvania, who I've been giving everybody a little glimpse of here and there, had a brain bleed, and they now confirmed what I told them 6 months ago, that he has temporal frontal dementia. He's in a rehab facility. He's fighting like crazy. He can't stand up, and he doesn't know where he is, but he wants to go back to his room, and in the ALF, assisted living facility, which isn't going to happen. And they're having a heck of a time with him. You know, he is a survivor of the Holocaust, and he migrated from Austria to Shanghai right after about 41, and just as Germany was invading Austria. And this is a man all his life who has been very strong-willed and determined. He figured out how to make it to the United States, get a college education, and go on to be fairly successful in business as a social worker, and he ran United Way for a number of years in a number of large communities, and he just won't go down for the count. I don't mean die,
right,
but even in spite of all of his infirmities, we are having a heck of a time trying to deal with it, and long-distance caregiving doesn't get any easier, even when you know, because I have expectations about what I want and how I want it done. So finally, Paul, what I did last week, and I told you, I got a hold of my friend Linda Woodward, who runs home care for Senior Bridge, yes, and for Humana around the country, and I said, I need a geriatric case manager in Philadelphia. Now, they didn't have the closest office they had was in Pittsburgh, which is a little ways away from Philadelphia. But she found me an excellent geriatric case manager who jumped right in. We talked the same language. She evaluated my uncle in the hospital, helped me pick out what facilities that I wanted him to go to, got to the other people, and notwithstanding the fact that she was great and I pushed from the other side, the system still let us down. I mean, they discharged him and never told anybody, including myself, where he was going, who was supposed to take care of him. And so I don't care how much you know. If you're not there, it is really, really tough.
Hard to believe they were discharged to an unsafe place not knowing where he was going.
Well, they kind of knew where he was going, but everybody else, from a rehab perspective, turned him down because they were balancing a brain bleed against a stroke, and he had been on a blood thinner, and so that was the choice they had. He probably knocked out having the stroke because he was on blood thinner, but he was in danger of bleeding out, and so it's been a delicate balancing match, and he has not been a very cooperative patient. But anyway, Paul, my weekend was a little tough. My wife wasn't feeling well. I know yours had a minor slip and fall.
Saturday morning, that's how we started the day.
All right, well, and I got up this morning, and my three favorite initials popped right up. UTI, urinary tract infection. And we called the doctor, but she's been on so many meds for this over the last few years that it's very hard to find one that's going to work. But we'll be back there tomorrow. We have great faith in our urologist that we will find something in the medical kit that hopefully will make a difference. It's very tough because it's not just everybody's UTI. When you have an autoimmune disease, as she does in dysautonomia, it makes it very, very tough. And for those of you that don't know what an autoimmune disease is, it's a disease within your body that fights with your own immune system, and your immune system attacks your own body. And it's very, very difficult to deal with things in a normal way when you don't have a healthy immune system. And Paul, I know that with your wife, we're dealing with something similar, not dysautonomia, but she's got an autoimmune disease. Why don't you touch on that a little bit?
I sure will. And my wife was listening to our show last week.
Yeah.
And she said, it would probably be a service if you were more specific about what's going on with me, because there's so many of our listeners who either have or may know someone who's going through it.
Right.
Debbie was diagnosed with lupus, and it was
Lupus.
Lupus.
Okay.
Lupus. And the way that she was diagnosed was just very, very odd. She actually became aware of her symptoms from her hairdresser.
Mm-hmm.
She was going to get her hair done, and the hairdresser noticed that large clumps of hair were starting to pull out, and where that hair had been, there was scar tissue that was beginning to form.
On her scalp?
On her scalp.
Wow.
So the hairdresser had suggested, I have no idea what this is. It's not from what I've been doing. And I had suggested, well, we need to see a dermatologist and find out what's going on.
Right.
And we had a very good board-certified dermatologist, practiced a lot of years, looked at it. He says, I have a suspicion what this might be, but I'm not ready exactly to say. But let me take a biopsy just to make sure. And, right then and there, they took a biopsy of that scar tissue. I mean, she left with the, it sewed up. And when she went home,
took a plug right
out. And then had recommended a specific dermatologist in the University of Miami and said, let's go there and find out.
Okay.
And we went down to the University of Miami, good examination. He said, it really appears that this is a classic case of lupus. But to what kind and what degree, we're not sure. And his recommendation was to find a good rheumatologist and have them do the necessary blood work to find out exactly what's going on.
Paul, do you know how many varieties of lupus there are?
I don't know the exact number. There's one called cutaneous, which is more related to the skin, but the more severe one is systemic.
Okay.
And that was the one that ultimately we found out that Debbie had. Meanwhile, she was working full-time, as I had indicated last week. She was a charge nurse at a surgical center. She had a lot of responsibility. I mean, she had to make sure that as many as 30, 40, sometimes 50 patients got through, 5 doctors. She was in charge of all of the codes. When somebody went bad during a surgical procedure, she would...
So she had a high-stress, high-visibility, heavy-duty job.
On her feet running from the minute she got there at 6 a.m. to the minute she left at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So she's, besides the symptoms of her hair, she was coming home and she was exhausted, dead on her feet. And shortly thereafter than that, it started with the muscle aches, the pain, and it became more and more difficult for her to get in and do her job.
Right. And let me ask you this question. You're always husband. Was it dawning on you yet that you might be converting also into a spousal caregiver?
No idea. I mean, it was just perplexing. It was things that seemed to be coming out of nowhere.
Right.
And we really didn't know. And honestly, at that point, I never even really heard of the word lupus. No idea as to the implications of it. Well, we did finally get to the rheumatologist, and they ran blood test after blood test after blood test. Oh, and by the way, when she was going back to the dermatologist, she was getting as many as 12 and 13 injections into her scalp at the same time. Mostly it was some sort of a cortisone mixture.
Okay, to try and break up the scar tissue or try and preserve the hair?
Preserve as much hair as she could. And
all right, so it was kind of like an alopecia, which is a loss of hair.
Yes.
Right.
And I was there in the room with her as a husband.
Right.
And I'm watching these injections, and to see the expression on her face as to how painful they actually were. And they were one after the other, after the other, after the other. And then it was to the rheumatologist and blood work done, and more blood work done, and more blood work done. Finally, they were able to do some, I think it was through a DNA test, they were able to confirm that she had lupus and a number of other related autoimmune diseases, fibromyalgia being one, connective tissue disorder being the other, but it all meant the same thing.
Right.
The body was starting to break down.
Right, and I understand that because my wife's condition of dysautonomia, which is a breakdown of the automatic nervous system, breathing, bowels, etc., I've mentioned it before, they don't work. And along with the autoimmune piece of it, she's had fibromyalgia, she's had chronic fatigue, add in, muscle spasms. I mean, we go to, and if it were not for her rheumatologist, along right now with her urologist, I don't know how I would keep and maintain her, because with the pain and the cortisone injections that he does, even though they don't last very long, as you kind of found out as well, without them, I don't think that she could endure some of the episodes of pain. She has a very high threshold of pain. She doesn't complain, but you can see it all over her face.
Absolutely. You can see it on her face, and you can just sense it happening. Compounding all of the physicalities that were going on, it was also the fact that she psychologically wasn't at a place where she could accept these changes. So she pushed herself to go to work. She pushed herself through the day and got up in the morning and could barely get out of bed from the pain. And, she's pushing stretches, she's bending down to do IVs, she's helping to move and lift patients, and she barely could walk herself by the end of the day.
I know that situation because, as you know, my wife had a very important position in the North Broward Hospital District. She had helped to create the Neuro Institute, and she was surrounded by neurologists. And she began to complain that she couldn't stay up on her feet. And I think I mentioned to you, maybe it was last week, I don't mean to be redundant, but they actually had to move a couch into her office so that she could lay down in the afternoon, because she was known as the Energizer Bunny. You would find her all over the hospital doing what had to be done, and she never took a breath. And so this was completely out of sorts for her. I knew that something was wrong. We couldn't put our hand on it. I do remember, and I'm going to let you get back to lupus in just a second, but I can remember the neurologist trying to figure out whether or not her cerebral spinal fluid in her brain was flowing properly, and we spent 1999, the New Year's of 1999, doing brain studies at the hospital and all through the New Year's Eve weekend. So we greeted 2000. It wasn't that the computers went crazy, but certainly trying to figure out a diagnosis for her was very, very difficult. And I empathize with all the people out there that have varieties of autoimmune disease. It is impossible, just impossible to deal with. I don't want to stop, so let's just keep on going.
Okay. So to continue on with the story, Debbie continued to go to work, and the nature of her disease is that a rash usually appears. They call it a butterfly rash that goes across the nose and it goes down the side of the face. It's very pronounced, swells up, sometimes it even scabs as a result of it. And of course, it's a very public position that Debbie had, so she really would never be able to speak about it. But really what became a very hurtful turning point to her was when she was called into the director's office and asked about this rash and could she cover her face. And meanwhile, she's suffering with this disease.
Almost like you had to go wear a burqa.
Almost. And, in my mind, I'm thinking, so much for the American Disabilities Act.
Right. Well, I guess if people saw the rash, I guess the concern was it contagious?
Of course.
What was it? And so I can understand in a clinical setting like that, not so much the other clinicians who may have understood what she was going through, but patients that were there for surgery may have been concerned.
And yes, easily understood. So there was a long discussion with the powers to be where she was, and it was becoming more apparent that she was not going to be able to continue on much longer because other symptoms rapidly began appearing. And perhaps one of the more serious ones that came was that her blood levels regarding her liver started to get quite severe. And
is that one of the typical symptoms of lupus?
Lupus attacks organs. Usually the kidney, the liver are the firsts that are attacked.
I want our audience to know we're being very candid with you. We're telling you the clinical story behind our wives so that you might have some appreciation not only of what they're going through, but when we begin to talk as caregivers, spousal caregivers, as husbands, and trying to do the double job of bringing in, the bacon, so to speak, and also trying to manage the day-to-day activities of our wives that are not in a position to do for themselves, but who do, and I really mean this because I know Debbie as well, is that they're suffering in silence not to impact us any further than they have to. And it's amazing to me that they do what they do and try and keep it away from us.
It really is. And, she was scared out of her mind. I felt powerless as both a husband and as a caregiver because this thing was taking off in all different directions. And I remember that the doctor ordered a biopsy of the liver. And that is not an easy test to have.
No.
And as a nurse, probably the worst enemy was the fact she knew as much as she did, because she knew what the procedures were, she knew what the numbers read, she looked at all of the blood reports before, as the doctor looked at them, and she pretty much knew what was going on. But she went in to have this liver biopsy done, and because of, again, autoimmune disorders, the next day she started to internally bleed. So she was back in the hospital the second day, and now they had to deal with two problems.
Yep. And I know, and for those of you that don't appreciate what it's like to be put on a table and have a biopsy needle, even though there's some radiographic ability to guide it, to have that needle go in and out of your liver, is a very significant medical procedure and not one to be taken lightly.
They call it a punch, and they actually take out a small chunk from various parts of the liver to see the functionality of what it may be. And The results on that showed that she had lost a significant part of her liver function. And what is important to know about that is that the liver is what strains out most of the medications and purifies the system.
Correct.
And the nature of lupus is that you're on a lot of medication.
Right, but your liver is not processing and eliminating it properly.
Sure. So it's a snowball sort of going down a hill. And many of these procedures that she had, she would be under anesthesia. And I know we've spoken about that numerous times.
Right.
And then she was starting then to show some memory issues. Now, it could be from the lupus, it could have been from the anesthesia, it could have been from the medications, but subtle changes started to happen. I mean, she would reverse numbers, she would forget the names of ordinary objects, sometimes more so, sometimes less so. Again, as a husband and as a caregiver, it really became very frightening. So now it was a whole round of neuro visits to neurologists, tests, trying to evaluate what it was. There was a concern it might have been multiple sclerosis. Could have been a lot of things.
Well, when you get into autoimmune disease,
you don't know.
You can break off into so many categories. You can have Parkinson's, you can have MS, you can have a whole range of diseases, and similar set of circumstances, just so that we can kind of run this a little bit in parallel. My wife, who was educated at the Medical College of Ohio, although she's not an MD, knew more than she should have.
Right.
And as a result of that, when she started, and here it was, she founded the Neuro Institute, whose main function in the beginning was they had the second memory disorder clinic in Florida, where they were evaluating people with dementia, with Alzheimer's, or whichever kind of dementia came through the front door, typically Alzheimer's. But one of the characteristics of what her complications are is something that they call brain fog, which is a little bit different than classic dementia. If you were to take a picture of her brain, you wouldn't find well, maybe by now you might, only because it's slowly age-related, but, and honey, if you're listening, I'm not calling you old. But it was causing confusion, and it was very scary, and it was along about, I guess it must have been about 2002, 2003, after we'd been looking and looking. As I told you, we went back to the Medical College of Ohio and found one of the few doctors in the country, Blair Grubb, who was a cardiologist, who figured out exactly what it was that she had. But even though we diagnosed it, he was quick to say that it typically occurs in children and young adults. And he was almost her oldest patient. And as a result of that, nobody knew what to expect. And even to this day, there's nobody that can give us an indication of what's happening, because nobody's dealt with somebody in their late 60s, early 70s that's had it this long. And so that's our predicament. Now, your wife came down with it. She's younger than my wife is, but it's a very slippery slope.
It is, and there is a lupus fog also, which again, it mirrors what you had gone through, and there would be times of confusion, as you said, and similarly, lupus typically affects predominantly women and predominantly younger women. And my wife, let's say middle age.
Right.
And it became more and more apparent that this was going to become more and more of a difficulty. And finally, it got to the point where she had to stop working, and now it was more time was spent home, much of it bedridden because of the physical pain. Many doctor's visits, and that's really where, as a caregiver, it really became difficult, because at every juncture of a doctor's visit or an appointment, there was a decision. Is this one that I need to be at? Is this one that she can go to by herself?
Did we even want them behind the wheel of the car?
Well, she couldn't drive at this point, so she was not driving, so it was arranging for a driver, hoping the driver would show up, hoping the doctor would allow for me to be on the phone to hear what is being said. because much of the visit she either wouldn't remember what was being told to her, and she went there with a list of things that needed to be discussed.
Right. You know, for our audience, we're getting close to the midpoint break, which we have to take for the station. But you're listening to us on WWNN 1470 AM, or you may be listening to us on iHeart.com. Just click on Florida and go to WNN. They don't use the first W. Or you may be watching us on CaregiverReality.com live show. And these shows typically get put up by Freddie, fortunately, within a day or so. They go out on YouTube, and I'm hoping that the public will become a little more aware of the fact that these autoimmune diseases in women of our wives' age are devastating. It takes on the whole family. I, who have been in this business for 25 years, encountered along about year 15 and married for a couple, 3 years, the idea that I was a caregiver, and even though I know it on behalf of everybody else, it took me a while to accept the fact that I was not a husband any longer, but that I had become an informal family caregiver, unpaid, in the trenches, trying to second guess what was happening, and without anybody, until I finally got a hold of you, Paul, and you're kind of my father confessor, because for the most part, most people that had caregiver issues came to me, and I couldn't see it in myself, and that's what makes it so difficult when you have to carve out your role in the family and your role as a caregiver. We're not quite ready to go to a break, but I want anybody that would like to, that has a comment, whether you have lupus, whether you're dealing as a spousal caregiver, we're at 888-565-1470. Would love to hear from you, because we're trying to break this down so that people understand that it happens everywhere. There are 50 million caregivers, and Paul and I are just 2 of 50 million, and every one of us has a unique story to tell. And while we sound an awful lot alike about autoimmune and high job positions and how to stop and all the rest of that, we're not quite the same story. And so we go back and forth, but yet we have a great respect for what it is that both of us are doing. And this is what we're trying to bring to our audience, I believe, Paul. The fact that being a caregiver is not a walk in the park. Being a long-distance caregiver, I can tell you this last month, is not easy. Being a caregiver, period, takes a lot of dedication, a lot of work, and a lot of caring. And when I say that, I don't say that singularly, because I know how much you care about your wife. And to see them going through this at an age when, I mean, we're a couple of years older than you, but where we should really be thinking about retirement, and we're thinking more about what it is that we're going to be dealing with in terms of the medical profession, is not really a comfortable place. And it's not comfortable for me as a professional in the business, and it's not comfortable for me as a family caregiver, thinking that this is her lot in life and essentially mine as well. So it's 7. I think we'll go to a break, and we'd love to hear from you, 888-565-1470. And when we come back, we'll have a little bit more, but we've got another piece from Dr. David Hilfiker, and tonight he's got a big surprise for us. And so let's take it away to the break.
Talk 1470 WWNN Pompano Beach, WKIS HD3 Boca Raton, Miami, Fort Lauderdale.
Hello, are you a family caregiver? Are you taking care of a spouse, parent, or loved one who can no longer care for themselves? Are you dealing with Alzheimer's disease and don't know what to do? Are you stressed, burned out, frustrated, and don't know where to turn? Have you realized that your doctor, lawyer, and mental health professionals don't have real practical answers? You need a non-clinical family caregiver expert that the professionals turn to. You need David Levy. He is a family caregiver expert with 25 years of active experience with thousands of family caregivers. He can help you provide a better quality of life for you and your loved one. Contact David Levy at dlevy@caregivered.org. That's dlevy at caregivered.org or call 561-482-0086. And let's get your mental road to healing started.
Okay, we're back, and Boca, America, and the world, you're hearing it like it really is. Paul and I are laying it out for you as spousal family caregivers. And by the way, starting next week, we're going to be on a half an hour earlier. We're going to be on from 6 to 7, and we hope that'll fit into your plans a little easier. We may catch some of you coming home from work. You'll be able to listen to us on 1470 AM if you're in the local area, iHeart.com if you've got whatever electronic device you have with you, and we look forward to expanding our audience with this new time frame. And Paul, we're going to come back to this subject obviously continuously, and I want to make sure, I know next week you won't be here,
yes,
but hopefully when you do come back the following week at 6, we can pick up not only with some of this, more of lupus, because I think your wife was 100% correct when she says people don't really understand. And it's no different than mine. You know, if you're not wearing a bandage, if you don't have your arm in a sling, if you're not out in a wheelchair trailing a body, an IV bottle, and you look like everybody else, everybody assumes there's nothing wrong with you.
What I'd like to do, hopefully, when we get together next time on this, David, is really to talk about the non-medical side of it and really how it affects lifestyle, friends, colleagues at work. I mean, this runs a long gamut of difficulties for anyone.
I can't tell you how many times that, and I know with you as well, how many times I juggle schedules. I have deliberately made my Monday open except for the radio show in order to try and do doctor's appointments and whatever else has to be taken care of, and during the week whenever it's necessary. But it's affected my family, it's affected my children, her children, and this is not easy. And as a matter of fact, we see some of these symptoms in some of our children because it's highly hereditary. And I just hope that isn't the case.
Well, I appreciate what you shared about your uncle in Philadelphia, because when my dad was in his last days, it was his caregiving on top of my wife's caregiving that really presents a challenge.
Oh, double caregiving by one person is definitely the height of the ability to keep more balls in the air than you ever imagined that you could, while trying to deal with a system that always seems to be pushing back at you. There's very little accommodation, even if you ask nicely. People are too busy inside the medical and I'm not casting aspersions at the medical profession, but you ask for an accommodation and it has to go up the food chain, and you have to keep going up and going up and going up until you finally get to the right person who says, I'll have to check on it because I don't directly know, when the person who did directly know didn't deal with you.
And that's when you have insurance.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you know, we have fee-for-service Medicare and supplemental policy and all the rest of it. And I cannot tell you, Paul, and although you have some idea because you do know, what our unreimbursed medical is annually. In excess of $25,000. And that's even with insurance coverage.
I understand.
All right. And so, you know, it makes a big difference. Anyway, we're back to our good friend Dr. David Hilfiker, who had taken a few days off because he had gotten some news from the National Institute of Health, who he had gone to get the research and the testing done.
Yes.
Because he couldn't get the answers that he really wanted. As he's told us in the past, the doctors all said he had cognitive impairment, mild, and all the researchers said, no, you have Alzheimer's. So Here we go with today. He said, since my thorough neuropsychological evaluation for cognitive impairment in late August, I have been nervously awaiting the results, which had been delayed in part by the government shutdown. It affected everything, including the National Institute of Health. Last Tuesday, I finally got them. The tests were completely normal. There's no sign of cognitive impairment.
Wow.
Now, that blew me away because we've heard the stories about the radio and all the trips to Virginia that he made to the prison with no recollection. The fact that he doesn't have cognitive impairment must be very, very confusing to him because of the symptoms that he does present with. And he says, this, of course, is wonderful news and should be great relief. I tend, however, to be a glass half-empty kind of guy, and I don't feel much relieved. I've traded a diagnosis, Alzheimer's disease, for a set of disturbing symptoms with no reasonable explanation. In case you've been reading these posts only occasionally, let me summarize. About 3 years ago, I started having symptoms of cognitive impairment, getting lost, inability to perform certain bookkeeping responsibility, increasingly poor memory, losing things constantly, and so on. All the things that we would normally expect to see with somebody with cognitive impairment advancing towards dementia. 2 years ago, I visited a neurologist who administered the usual cognitive testing, which revealed mild impairment. Repeat testing a year later also showed a mild degree of impairment. Other major causes of cognitive impairment were ruled out, so I was left with a big diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, probably Alzheimer's. This blog has been a description of my ongoing experience with this impairment. As part of research studies that I participated in, I've now had, over the past 8 months, none of which has shown any sign of Alzheimer's disease. This most recent neurological set of tests at the NIH was very intensive and extensive, about 4 hours in length. Unlike the previous, less thorough tests of cognitive function, this more rigorous evaluation showed no sign of cognitive impairment. So now I have a set of symptoms that have impaired me for several years, but for which I can find no reasonable explanation. It's just astounding. The reason I have avoided making entries in this blog over the past week is that I haven't known what to write. This has so stunned me that I've had to talk it through with my family and some friends. So far, I can't explain it in any reasonable way. Here are some of my thoughts that I've had. Perhaps my previous diagnosed cognitive impairment has resolved and I've gotten better. Unlikely. My symptoms haven't gone away. Also, any cause of cognitive impairment of longer than 6 months that might improve with time, like a vitamin B12 deficiency, has been medically ruled out. These things just don't get better. And I'm going to the next page. Perhaps all the brain scans and the neuropsychological tests have been wrong. Unlikely. Any medical test, of course, can be normal even when the disease is present. In the case of tests, I've had this false negative rate is very roughly 10% for each. Mathematically, that means there is more than a 99.9% chance that at least one of the tests would be positive if I had Alzheimer's. Perhaps it's some other form of cognitive impairment. Unlikely. Not only have I been thoroughly evaluated to rule out the other reasonable causes, but the intense cognitive testing includes no sign of impairment for any reason. And then he goes on to say, perhaps I'm imagining it. Always a possibility, but people very close to me have also seen obvious evidence of impairment for several years, and no one, including a trained psychologist who knows me well, finds this possibility credible. I don't either. There are a number of other possibilities I'll explore in later posts, but for now, any explanation I've been able to come up with is highly improbable. As I've written before, all of this can be extremely unsettling. For several days last week, I felt quite unmoored, like a ship. I'd come to terms with my identity as an Alzheimer's patient, and now it had become, at the very least, uncertain. This life over the past year as an Alzheimer's patient had become very meaningful and fulfilling. What was I now? What was I going to do? But after lots of conversations with friends and family, I no longer feel so unmoored. This is but one more twist in a bumpy, uncertain road. I can trust myself and my perceptions. I can simply wait for the next step in this strange journey. I feel ready to let go and see what exciting things will happen. He's got a wonderful attitude. These test results, whatever they ultimately mean, are good news. At the very least, the impairment I perceive is progressing very slowly. At the very least, this is another opportunity to learn to live with uncertainty, just as most people with mild cognitive symptoms have to. It's an opportunity to let go of self. And he concludes with, the wild ride continues. Paul, this is just an amazing, amazing story. I really expected after he took the break to come back this week just like you did and
talked about it
and finally be told that he has Alzheimer's. And to the audience who's been following us with this, and there's a picture up, if you're watching, of Dr. Hilfiker, and his is very strange. I don't want anybody out there to think for one moment that what Dr. Hilfiker is going through has any relationship to anybody else. If you've seen one case, you've seen one case. And in this particular situation, while it has stayed within mild cognitive impairment, we've been reading about him for a while, and he certainly presents with a variety of symptoms that all seem to indicate some aspect of dementia. So going forward, this is going to be a very confusing but a very interesting person to continue to observe. And I hope once he gets a little grounded, now that he's not quite so unmoored, maybe towards the end of the month I can convince him to come back on. And we had him on, about 6 weeks ago, and see what's going on.
You know, I can only imagine how unsettling that must be, and wondering, well, if it's not that, what might it be? Sometimes not knowing is worse than actually knowing.
Yes, and he had taken some comfort in kind of having a position in his life with this mild cognitive impairment diagnosis, moving towards Alzheimer's, but never quite getting there. So the symptoms haven't gone away. Definitionally, or by way of testing, he appears to have nothing, but yet, even though the tests show nothing, he's still suffering with his symptoms. So I think it's stay tuned, because there's a lot more to be told out of this story. I saw a news blast just before we came on from Reuters, and not getting into the full report. Keep going.
In fact, some of the dramatic risks and breakthroughs you may hear about are not so impressive when you consider 3 common pitfalls in how medical news is reported and interpreted. First, an association between a possible risk factor and a disease is often mistakenly assumed to mean that the risk factor causes the disease.
I think they go on to give a pretty good explanation in there of what that means, in case that's a little bit confusing.
It is. Relative risk, second point, that is your risk in relationship to the risk of others, is reported without mention of absolute risk.
Right, and I think what they meant there was, if everybody has a cold and you don't, the risk of taking a certain cold medicine and whatever the side effects may be just don't affect you. And so they don't talk about the absolute risk, they only talk about the risk related to the population at risk. And that can be very confusing at times, I believe.
This last one, though, I think is striking. Preliminary research is assumed to be the last word.
Yeah, that's my big complaint.
The difference between association and cause. A study found an increased risk of breast cancer among women 65 with high bone density. If you only read the headline or briefly glanced at the article, it might appear that high bone density causes breast cancer, yet high bone density viewed as a good thing because it helps to avoid the complications of osteoporosis, a disorder of low bone density in which hip, wrist, and spine fractures may occur. Does this mean a woman should strive for high bone density, which may put her at risk for breast cancer, or should she accept low density and osteoporosis?
Well, I don't think that there's even a comparison there. I think a woman should do the best she can, although we are dealing in this day and age, but we won't get into it tonight, with BRCA gene, that a lot of younger women, on determination that they have it and the likelihood of getting breast cancer, but there's a direct association there. And so when they elect at 30 and 35 to have a double mastectomy, they're doing it because the risk of having that gene and potentially having breast cancer is a lot different than having a bone density relationship.
I think Angelina Jolie and the actions that she had taken clearly demonstrate that this is on the mind of many women.
Absolutely. I think this, and this is why we see so many pink things abounding, because it is on everybody's mind.
Continuing on, a more complete reading of the story sorts this out. Bone density is not a cause of breast cancer, but it is an indirect measure of levels of hormones such as testosterone and estrogen that have been linked to both bone density and breast cancer. The real news of this report is that higher bone density is associated with increased risk of breast cancer, and is in quotations, and may help predict its development, unquote, end quotation, not that high bone density will cause breast cancer.
All right. Well, there's a big difference between an association and a direct causal link. All right, and there's nothing that says high bone density causes breast cancer. But when you read the headline, sure, that's exactly what people jump to. It's just like the cures in Alzheimer's and the breakthroughs and the fact that caregivers live longer. And then we go and we look and we see that when we dive into the reporting, it doesn't say what the headline says.
Well, hope springs eternal.
Well, we always hope that we're going to find a good one.
Yeah.
But this seems to leave a little bit. I think there's one more piece in there, Paul.
Okay.
If you
consider the near panic over a medication last year. Many news outlets reported a dramatic increase in the risk of stroke among patients taking this medication, which was an ingredient in many over-the-counter medications. A person using it for an over-the-counter usage may triple her risk of stroke. The risk was even higher if she took PPA in the form of an appetite suppressant. Although it sounds bad, realize that this is a relative risk, one risk, that of women taking PPA compared with another, that of women not taking PPA.
Right, and that was what we were talking about before. If you're on a cold medication or whatever that happened to have been, that also is a product in many other things. If you're not taking it, there's no risk. And if it is, whatever that related risk is to stroke does not affect everybody, because not everybody, A, is taking that medication, has a cold, or gets a stroke. But yet, when you read the headline that XYZ med causes stroke, and all of a sudden everybody says, I can't take it, I'm going off of it, they call their doctor, and he's not really sure. So what does he say? Hey, if there's even an association, don't take it. So America, this is a problem we're all going to be dealing with moving forward. How accurate is the news? We live in a world of sound bites. We get glimpses and little pieces depending upon what the news media, the print media, and everybody else wants to tell us. But if we don't go ahead, and that's one of the things that Paul and I are trying to do for you, is go ahead and dig into the research a little bit. And here was a very, very good article that goes on to say, unless you see the word absolute, it doesn't mean anything if you're not using it if it's a relative risk, if it's not a direct causal effect. And so what happens is it's like the tide runs in and out. We scare the heck out of people, and then we say it's okay, and then we get another one, and then somebody else says it's different. And so what is the American public supposed to do? And pharmaceuticals and over-the-counter medication have a lot of things in them, and everybody's a little different. Just as you and I have been talking about how both of our wives have autoimmune diseases, but they're as different succinctly as night is from day. And so if we need to get accurate reporting and not something that just catches the headlines. But we have become a nation of sound bites and a nation of headline reading only. And I think that going forward in the future, as we come across articles like caregiving increases longevity, we're going to be quick to dive into it and see that it was very, very unrelated, not absolute, and was an extrapolation of some of the study that had nothing to do really with the subject that was being discussed. So I see we got a couple more minutes left. I want to let you know we're going to be starting a half hour earlier next week. We're going to be on from 6 to 7. Paul won't be here, but I will have a guest. I'm trying to firm up one of two that will join me, either of which I think our audience will enjoy. And Paul, what are your concluding remarks?
Well, I hope what we have been bringing to the listeners have struck a chord that we are part of them, those that are non-clinical family caregivers, unpaid caregivers. This is from the heart. It really is a passion and a mission, and we are there with you fighting the same battle, and it's here that you're going to find where the real information is.
Right. We can't yuck it up. We can't turn it into super sensational, because that would detract from what we're doing. But yet, we're trying to break it down, tell it like it is, so that people that are caregivers can say, yeah, that's a competent authority. I can trust those guys, at least to give me the real skinny, and then I'll still make up my own mind. So Boca Raton, America and the world, it's been a pleasure being here this evening. We're on caregiverreality.com, iHeart.com, and WWNN right here in Boca Raton, 1470 AM. And so until next week, when we'll be starting a half hour earlier on from 6 to 7, this is David Levy and Paul Vattiato saying have a great evening, and I hope you learned a little something. I know I did.
Good night, David.
Good night, Paul.
You have been listening and watching David Levy, gerontologist and non-clinical family caregiving expert. Visit our website at caregiverreality.com and hear and see unscripted family caregiver support groups discussing all of the questions that you have wanted to ask but didn't know where to turn. Tune in again next time for more updates and special guests who bring their caregiving experience to you so that you can deal with your problems and hear how family caregiving is affecting fellow Americans just like you. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored